another analysis. Today, we're digging into some really fascinating work by a psychologist named Dr. Castell Britton. And he takes us deep, I mean deep, inside the mind of a hitman, not just to look at the violence itself, but to understand the exact mental checklist, the sequence that happens right before he pulls the trigger, every single time.
So Dr. Britton's research, which he did inside a Colombian prison, uncovered something that's, well, it's pretty startling. He's talking to this hitman, a guy named Miguel, and he realizes that for him, the lead up to a killing wasn't this chaotic, impulsive thing at all. It was the opposite. It was a predictable, almost ritualistic sequence of thoughts inside his head.
Just so you know, everything we're talking about today comes straight from Dr. Britton's article and his interviews with Miguel. This gives us a really rare, methodical look at the psychology before the violence happens. It's a subject he goes into a lot more detail on in his book, which is called Dangerous Minds.
Okay, so before we can really get into Miguel's head, we need to understand a key idea from Dr. Britton. It's called the identity restoration theory. And what it basically says is this. For some people who feel, undefined or small or just diminished, committing extreme acts isn't random. It's actually a desperate, if totally destructive way to build a powerful sense of self.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's break this down. We're going to walk through the 10 thoughts Miguel had step by step in the exact order they happened. And his internal sequence, it always kicked off with one really powerful core thought.
So thought number one was always survival. But, and this is crucial, it's not survival in the way you and I might think of it. Like someone's physically attacking you. For Miguel, it was about protecting this deep inner psychological self. A self that was created in a childhood where, if you hesitated, even for a second, there were serious consequences. His body basically learned to react way before his mind ever had a chance to think. Okay, so after that survival instinct kicks in, the second thought in the sequence yanks his focus completely away from the present moment and throws him straight back into the past. His mind just gets flooded with these old memories, childhood stuff, moments where he was dismissed, made to feel small, totally powerless. And we're not talking about fuzzy, distant memories here. No, they would come roaring back with all of that original emotional pain, so much so that it would completely blot out the actual person standing in front of him. Now we're at the third thought, and this is where things really start to escalate. It centers on an emotion that, well, we all know it, but here it's unleashed in a totally different and, frankly, terrifying way. And that emotion is anger. But this isn't just regular anger. We're talking about years and years of accumulated rage, just building up silently, with nowhere to go. See, no one ever taught him how to handle it, how to even talk about it, so it just stayed there, in his body, waiting. And for him, the only way out, the only possible release for that feeling, was physical violence. All right, on to the fourth thought. This one is a really powerful coping mechanism, something that started out as a way to protect himself, but over time, it became his entire way of life. What did he do? He would just switch off his emotions, completely, just numbness. And like Dr. Britton explains in his book Dangerous Minds, this is a defense mechanism you learn in a dangerous childhood. It's an adaptation you make when showing emotion is more likely to get you hurt than to get you help. And for Miguel, eventually, that numbness just became his default setting. Okay, now this next one is really interesting because it ties directly back to that big idea we talked about at the beginning, Dr. Britton's identity restoration theory. Think about it. In a world where Miguel felt totally invisible, like he didn't even exist, violence gave him an identity. Every single act reinforced it, it solidified this new sense of self. And just through repetition over and over, violence went from being something he did to being who he was. It was the only version of himself that actually felt real to him.
So the sixth thought, this one's all about fear. But you guessed it, it's probably not the kind of fear you're thinking of. Yeah, Miguel's real fear wasn't about dying, it was about being seen as weak. It was a fear of being exposed, of being vulnerable. He learned a long time ago that showing any kind of vulnerability, any hesitation, that's what got you hurt. So for him, quick, decisive violence became his armor. It was his way of projecting strength and protecting himself from ever being seen as weak again. And all of this hardening of himself, it leads to a really crucial psychological shift. And that brings us to the seventh thought in his internal sequence. Now, the key thing to understand here is, it's not that he didn't know the difference between right and wrong. He did. The problem was, in those high-stakes moments, those ideas just felt distant, unreachable. That immediate, overwhelming need for psychological survival just took over all the mental space where something like moral reflection should have been. The eighth thought,
This one, to me, is maybe one of the most tragic and deeply human parts of this whole destructive pattern. Because at its core, it illustrates this fundamental human desire for recognition. I mean, after an entire life of feeling invisible, the fear he could inspire in other people, that was a powerful, even if it was destructive, way of finally being seen. It's like that quote from Dr. Britton, "A dangerous mind often comes from the silence, where a child's voice was never heard."
And that brings us to the ninth thought, which really shows us what was hiding behind that desperate need to be seen.
You see, this was never really a search for power. It was really an attempt to fill this deep, profound emptiness inside him. The act of violence, it created a sensation, it got a reaction, it had consequences. For a moment, it was tangible proof that he was real, that he existed. But that feeling never lasted. It was fleeting, and that huge void was always right there waiting for him underneath it all.
And that brings us to the end of the line, the 10th and final thought. This is the last internal step, the moment right before the act itself.
And what was it? It was silence. But not a peaceful, meditative kind of silence. No, this was an empty silence. It was the sound of a life that was never given the emotional tools, the language, to pause, to think, or to stop that straight line that went directly from a thought to pulling the trigger.
So when you look at all this, what Dr. Britton's work really shows us is that extreme violence often isn't some sudden storm that comes out of nowhere. It's a pattern that's formed, slowly, gradually, inside a mind that was shaped to endure things, not to feel them. And McGill's story, man, it's such a powerful reminder of that process. And it leaves us with a really critical question to think about. If this kind of violence is a pattern that's born from emotional silence, what does it actually mean to truly listen?